Today is an interesting day. I got up, got to the studio, got ready to jump into work when I discovered that something very exciting happened today. Joe Rogan published a new interview with Elon Musk. And for anybody who happens to follow Musk and Twitter, especially lately, he's been on a bit of a weird kick, tweeting things like Tesla stock is overvalued and raging against the economic shutdown and the lack of freedoms that he sees in people not being able to go to work and do the work that they want to do. And understanding Musk as someone who is just a brain filled with endless ideas for the world and for humanity, taking a break from being able to work on that kind of stuff is obviously a very frustrating experience for him. And of course, he had a baby on the 4th as well, I believe his 5th child, and 5 sons, I think. Fascinating. It's been really fascinating to watch the manic episodes that he puts on public display where it almost feels like he's trolling the world. There's a community on Reddit called Wall Street Bets where it's basically just a bunch of kids in their basements, at least they proclaim to be, coming up with the most absurd stock trading strategies to make hundreds of thousands of dollars and then lose it all again and basically joke about the whole thing as if it's all just some silly game. And they, of course, love Elon Musk, and they're convinced that he's one of them because when he goes to tweet something like, I think Tesla is overvalued right now, and the stock drops, I don't know what, 20, 30% in a day or two, they all think it's hilarious, especially because the stock goes right back up again. And it seems like even Elon can't stop people from investing in the hype that is behind Tesla, and for good reason. So anyway, seeing that Elon went on Joe Rogan and was potentially going to be talking about all this stuff, I had to put away everything else that I was going to be working on today and jump right into that episode, and it was well worth the time. He spends at least the first half hour of the 2-hour interview talking about Neuralink and his ideas for developing brain-machine interfaces to enable us to have a faster data communication with this artificial intelligence neural net that we are building that is essentially what the internet is. It's all of these disparate computers that are able to do all these calculations, and we are able to harness the power of those calculations with our own human intuition. And the faster we can make that data rate, the more incredible work that we can do as human beings in this universe. And it's always fascinating to hear Elon's perspective on these ideas, because I spent a lot of time thinking about consciousness and what consciousness is, because when you look at the development of hydrogen, essentially blowing up in stars, becoming more complex elements, eventually forming planets, rocky planets, where bacteria eventually arise and then evolve for 4 billion years and somehow along the way become complex enough to develop language and thinking and planning and dreaming and all of the high level concepts that we associate with humanity that we think of as being, this wonderful, otherworldly thing that is totally distinct from the rest of life on this planet. And yet, when you look at a baby, for example, and you watch it develop from being this totally almost inanimate object that it has no awareness of the world around it. It's literally just taking in information, but it's not doing anything with that information yet. But then watching some kind of consciousness and awareness of its world slowly emerge, and you realize that consciousness is really a wide gradient. There is no definitive line between an unconscious being that is able to interact with his environment, like plants can respond to light, or, something that's complex enough to be able to understand its environment, understand its interactions with them, and have thought and planning and memory of the past that enables it to change the future. So that gradient is really what's so interesting. And when you start to think about computers developing understanding of the world, that is eventually going to be sufficiently complex that it will be indistinguishable from what we describe as consciousness in human beings. I'm fascinated by other people's perspective on that topic, people who I know have put a lot of thought into these ideas. And Elon is definitely somebody who's put a lot of thought into it. And even more fascinating is that he's actually doing something about it, because a lot of these thought experiments, for example, like what would happen if I took all of my memories, took a snapshot of them, and then embedded them in somebody else's brain? Would they be me? they would think that they were me. I think that that would be pretty clear. They would have every awareness of being me as if they were always me, because they would have all of my memories leading up to that point. But now at this point, there's two me. And when you talk about, consciousness or the id, the ego, the soul, what is the soul? When you start thinking about duplicating memories and brains and all of this kind of future tech that is theoretically possible with this technology, like brain-machine interfaces, it seems like the idea of consciousness and the ego as being separate from physical reality, it seems like that breaks down. Or if it doesn't break down, at least it's easily duplicable. And that seems to kind of fly in the face of this concept of dualism where, you have the physical world and you have the spiritual world, and the spiritual world imparts the soul into a body in the physical world. That I think is probably pretty commonplace amongst most thinkers today, most philosophers today. When you start thinking about duplicating this kind of stuff, I'm just not sure how that dualism can continue to hold true. So I'm fascinated by, people who are able to think about these ideas and actually try to implement them in the real world with real engineering to test them. And that's essentially what Elon is doing with his company Neuralink, where he's developing brain-machine interfaces. So hearing, him talk about why he's doing it, what he thinks is possible in doing it, and also hearing, what he's learned along the way already so far with implementing or developing this technology, he thinks that they could be already within a year of implanting the first chip into somebody's brain. And of course, they're going to start with people with brain injuries, things like paralysis from stroke or spinal injuries or things like that. He thinks that they can potentially restore sight to people who've lost their optic nerve, restore the ability for their brain to communicate with their limbs in situations where they've had some sort of separation, either in the spinal cord or something going on in the brain that means that they can't move a limb. They can actually bypass that now. You see some of these fake hands that people can control with their mind. Well, we just need a better data connection between the brain and those limbs in order for people to be able to use those limbs as if they were their own limbs. And so brain-machine interfaces really will allow all of that. And they're already, within the next year, potentially going to be able to start testing these on real live patients with significant problems that they might be able to alleviate. So that's incredibly exciting. Elon did say that he thinks that it'll probably be 5 to 10 years before we start seeing it in healthy adults who are able to get these chips simply to have a faster communication with their computers. Although, to be honest, that 5-year, it's the first time I've heard 5 years for that. As far as I've seen, every other prediction has been in the 10 to 20 year time frame. And either Elon is just on Elon time right now, which is usually about 2 to 2.5 times, or it's possible that, in jumping into the actual development of the technology, he's starting to see a faster potential time frame, and that's really exciting to think about. So anyway, I just wanted to review some of these quotes that I've been pulling out of this interview, because he has such a really interesting perspective and a way of explaining some of these concepts that I find really interesting and inspiring. He says that the entirety of human experience is electrical signals to a brain in a vat, and the vat is your skull. And that's, I think, an old philosophical thought experiment of thinking of, well, what if the brain was just a brain in a vat? How do we not know that our brains aren't just in a vat somewhere and we're being fed, the signals that tell us that we're here in this world with this table and that reality is real, but it's just the Matrix in reality. And that's essentially what the concept of the movie The Matrix is. And what's funny is that while we can't necessarily devise experiments to be able to test that today, we can at least start thinking about the fact that our brain actually is just a brain in a vat. And that vat is our skull. And so when we think about it from that perspective, and then we start thinking about developing something like Neuralink or brain-machine interface, where we can put wires into our brain and stimulate the brain to create new memories, to change our experience, to, when something happens on the other side of the world, somebody's watching the sunset, I could watch it on my phone right now if they're filming it, but if we get a good enough input into the brain that we can actually feed it experiences, I'm talking the full 5 senses as well as emotion, and then we could have somebody sensing it there with their brain and all of their senses, they can be uploading that experience to the cloud through, their data connection. And I could be experiencing that live as if I were there through the inputs into my brain. And all of a sudden we become walking versions of the Matrix, where we have agency to be able to move around in the world, but we also have the ability to connect to other people, to other places, to other times, and have other experiences that we're much more limited in doing through just our audio and visual inputs right now when we watch movies or YouTube videos or things like that. And I think that's going to be really interesting to think about how that's going to develop once we have these interfaces. Elon talks a lot about how language is really just a compression of concepts, and how we can have these incredible concepts in our head, and that in order to be able to communicate them to other people, we have to compress them down into these really inefficient, inadequate versions of those concepts, and then speak them to another person with language, and then that other person has to decompress it and try to create their own understanding of it, which is inevitably going to be warped from my own understanding of it. And while that is a challenge, it also can be a really interesting way of changing our own understanding of things. When we have to compress them down and communicate them to someone else, it changes our understanding of it. It enables us to understand it in a deeper and more meaningful way. But something is lost along the way. And if we really want to be able to have better communication between human beings, we need a better data rate. We need a better transmission of what I'm thinking and what I'm experiencing. I need to be able to more easily and more quickly share that with other people so that we can have a closer human connection. We can have a more real human connection. And it's really interesting because Joe at some point, and Joe Rogan really actually is a good interviewer for these kinds of topics, because when you have two people that really understand the high level concepts together, they start talking about it in a way that's often not accessible for a layperson. And Joe really jumps in and he asks Elon, what makes us afraid of this potential technology? He says, won't it just make us unemotional robots? And it is really interesting that is a common response to this kind of technology. That technology kind of removes our humanity. And I think that we see that because we're constantly dealing with technology that's at its early phases, its beta phase. It's not where it can be yet. And in that intermediary phase, we're learning how to use it. And so in today's world, we see phones as being something that takes us away from our human connection and forces us to deal with this really inadequate, compressed connection method. Like, let's say you're texting with people. It's never the same thing. It doesn't capture the same kind of communication that a real face-to-face conversation will, because in a face-to-face conversation, there's so much more that we pick up on. There's the emotion, there's the facial expressions, and even with video chat, we're already seeing people are experimenting with Zoom, with these video chats now. It's better than texting. It's better than a phone call because you get some of that face-to-face, but it's still inadequate. It still doesn't fully give you that communication level that you can have in a real in-person conversation. And so the challenge is, how do we go from these technologies now that are totally inadequate and get to a level of technology that is indistinguishable from real face-to-face human interaction? And that's where you have to realize that once the technology gets sufficiently complex and the data throughput and the amount of data that's being picked up and transmitted in these communications, then it really will enable more human interaction and a higher level of human interaction. Rather than making us robotic and unemotional, it raises the potential for the amount of higher level experience we can have and the amount of higher level experience we can share with other people. And I think that's why these technologies are so exciting, but it's really fascinating to see how, for most people who don't spend the time really thinking about it and really understanding what the potential is, the short term does seem to be really scary. It's just going to turn us all into robots. It's going to make us unemotional, non-human, lower primitive kind of beings. And Elon has a great quote on this where he talks about the brain as being essentially two different parts. And he admits that it is a simplistic view of the brain, and most brain experts will take some umbrage with this explanation. But essentially, you've got the animal brain, the limbic system, and then you've got the cortex, which is layered on top of that. And maybe I'll just read this quote to you because he really explains this so well. Essentially, you've got the primitive brain and you've got the smart brain, the brain that's capable of planning and understanding concepts and difficult things that a monkey can't understand. Your cortex is much smarter than your limbic system. Nonetheless, they work together well. I haven't met anyone who wants to delete their limbic system or their cortex. People are quite happy having both. So you can think of the computer, the AI, as being a third layer, a tertiary layer that can be symbiotic with the cortex. It will be much smarter than the cortex, but you essentially have 3 layers. And you actually have that right now. Your phone is capable of things, and your computer is capable of things that your brain is definitely not. Storing terabytes of information perfectly. Doing incredible calculations that we couldn't even come close to doing. You have that with your computer. It's just that the data rate is slow. Your connection is weak. And then he goes on to say, you are already symbiotic with computers, and there's quite a bit of AI or neural nets. Increasingly, neural nets are taking over from regular programming. If you use Google Voice or Alexa or one of those voice assistants, it is using a neural net to decode your speech and try to understand what you're saying. If you're trying to do image recognition or try to decode a photograph, neural nets are the best way to do that. So you are already sort of a cybernetic symbiote. It's just a question of your data rate. The communication speed between your phone and your brain is slow. So when we think about technology and the fear of technology to kind of dehumanize us, you realize it's really just it's a data rate issue. Computers and artificial intelligence can sit on top of our current brain layer and raise the potential for what we're able to do. They don't have to be separate from it. And increasingly, over the past decade, if you spend any amount of time with an iPhone or some other smartphone in your pocket, I remember my first iPhone was probably in like 2010, 3 years after, I think I had a 3G was the first one I got, 3 years after the iPhone had already been out. And it was still so primitive that I hardly used the web browsing, any of the apps. It was mostly just texting, maybe taking pictures. Even that I rarely did with it because the cameras weren't very good. Things were slow. You'd open up the camera, you'd go to take a picture, and there was like a bit of a lag. You would never capture exactly what you wanted. And if you're used to using a real camera, which was just like boom, bang, you got a photo, you're not going to use a phone. But the way that that technology has developed in our pockets year over year over year to the way that they are today, I think has changed people's perspectives on how quickly this technology can evolve and also how slow it feels when you're living in it. And that's why when I start to think about these neural brain-machine interfaces as being something of like science fiction future, and then you start to hear somebody like Elon talk about actually building one and getting them in human beings in the next year and getting them in healthy human beings in the next decade, it seems and it feels real. It feels possible. And it's an exciting future to think about. And so I always like to take a little bit of time out of my day for things that inspire me. And anytime I get to hear Elon talk, whether it's about SpaceX and the rocket technology that he's developing to take humanity to the stars, starting with Mars, or it's about moving our energy economy to a sustainable economy versus an oil-based economy that's dumping carbon into the atmosphere and will eventually run out, and who knows what kind of damage it will do to the planet in the short term, or whether it's about figuring out how to improve our connection with computers so that as computers become intelligent, that they don't simply move on and leave us behind, but that we find a way to merge with them in symbiosis. It's amazing to me that we are so fortunate to live at a time where somebody who's working so intimately with these problems and thinking so deeply about these problems is willing to share it at the level that we can experience that thought process and come along for the ride and even have conversations with other people about it as a result. So that's my inspiration for today. That's my inspiration for this week. And that's going to be my video for today. I think I'm going to take the rest of the day off from trying to film anything productive because I would like to sit with some of this thinking. My new skates arrived in the mail today, so I need to get home and try those out. So I think that's going to be a wrap for today. But I'd love to hear what you're thinking about, what you are working on in quarantine, and how you are finding ways to stay inspired, because this inspires me. And imagining a future where we can live on Mars, where we can be intimately connected with any other human beings that we want to be intimately connected with, no matter where we are, no matter how separated we are from them, through high throughput data connections that are directly implanted into our brains. That's a future that I can get excited for, and that dreaming about will help me get up every day and do the work that I need to do in order to be an active participant in that future. So anyway, thanks for listening to me ramble on why this latest interview with Elon Musk on Joe Rogan has inspired me today. And yeah, drop me a comment. Let me know what's inspiring you right now. Peace.